In this last lecture on the 3rd century, I want to talk about a few things. One is Dura, which is a fort in Syria, a Roman fort in Syria, and it just happened to contain one of the earliest Christian churches that we know of. So I'll show you a few slides of that. Then I want to talk about something that was happening in the Roman Empire called the 3rd century crisis. And this started in the early 200s and lasted almost up to the end of the 200s and was partially stopped by an emperor named Diocletian. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And I also want to talk about Diocletian's role in something called the Great Persecution. Okay, what you're looking at here on the left side of the slide is a map of Dura, this Roman fort. Now, I should have given you a bigger map here, but this is right on the border of Syria and Iraq today. And this was partly, or was, Roman territory. And the Romans and the Persians had been fighting for a very long time, so Rome built a series of forts. Now, what was happening during this particular period is that the Persians were coming to invade, and the Romans started to panic because they didn't think that the fort would be able to survive. So what you have back here is the fort was built up against the Euphrates River on a very tall hill. There's a ravine here and a ravine here, and what you have is this is the way that you would enter the fort. So what the Romans ended up doing, instead of relying on their walls, they started piling up sand along the outer edge and decided that may not be enough, because what would happen with these fights over the forts is that the Persian would start digging tunnels. And the idea is that you dig a tunnel under the fort and then set a fire by one of these pillars that's holding up the fort walls, and then that would cause that to collapse, and then they'd be able to invade pretty quickly. So when the Romans decided that they had to build up these walls, and what they ended up doing is piling sand over the outer wall and into this first street of the fort. And that way, if they did tunnel under, which they ended up doing, and if the pillar would not totally collapse. So that's what they were hoping for. We have some really interesting archaeology of this particular fort. We know we had tunnels, and we know that the Romans dug counter tunnels to try and collapse these. Now, in the end, what happened is the Persians captured this fort, and then in the 1920s, you've got some archaeology done on here. And the most amazing thing that happened during this time is that they started digging the sand out of this first street. And what they ended up finding in this area here is, at that point, the earliest Christian church that had been discovered. And what I have here on the right side of your slide is a picture of this early Christian church. So this is pretty amazing to find at a Roman fort, because it's been thought that Christianity was outlawed. Now, we're not quite sure if this was an open building that said this is a Christian church, but it was a pretty amazing find, because again, we're talking about the 230s AD, and it's the earliest church that had been discovered. Also, some interesting stuff right next to it was a Jewish synagogue. Many of these buildings that are grayed out were temples to all these various gods and goddesses for Rome. And again, you've got the earliest Christian church, so pretty amazing. Okay, I want to talk about the 3rd century crisis, and you're probably wondering why we're talking about that when this is a class on early Christianity. But you have to remember that the Christians were living in the Roman Empire. And so what was affecting the empire also affected them. And this 3rd century crisis was a pretty severe one. So a couple of the reasons for why it happened is that you've got the Persians attacking on the eastern side, and we were just talking about that. In the north, you've got attack by the barbarian groups, the Goths and other tribes in the northern part. So they're coming down, the Persians are pushing from the east, and the Romans decide that they're going to make their army larger. And of course, what you have to do to make the army larger is to pay for them. So taxes were raised and raised again. You see a whole series of emperors starting in the 230s. And this is like one emperor after the next. They weren't living very long, and this caused a lot of instability in the Roman Empire. Now, what the emperors decided to do to pay the army is something called devaluation of the money. And what that meant is, imagine a silver dollar. So silver dollar is supposed to contain $1 worth of silver, but what the Romans ended up doing is ultimately giving a silver dollar a copper interior. And what they would do is they would just wash it in silver and say, here you go, this is worth $1 worth of silver, and it really wasn't, and people realized that. And what that meant is that prices started to increase drastically because of inflation. You've got the one person who ended up stopping the 3rd century crisis, which is Emperor Diocletian, and I'll talk about him in just a minute. And we'll talk about Constantine in the next lecture. I will skip that part right here. One of the things that also happened, which is pretty severe for the Romans, was that you've got the capture of an emperor who went to war with the Persians. And I've talked about this before when we talked about the Manichaeans. So you've got the defeat of Valerian. He's the emperor who was caught and he was never rescued and died in the Persian Empire. And I also showed you this slide showing you Shapur I sitting on his horse, and you've got these other emperors begging for Shapur not to invade any deeper. And in the end, in this particular war, what the Romans agreed to was to pay the Persians a huge amount of money every single year. And it's one of the rare occasions you have in Roman history where they're actually doing this. So I always like coins. I just want to show you a few of the coins from Shapur. And then, as I mentioned, the person who stopped the 3rd century crisis, or at least slowed it down, was an emperor named Diocletian. He was not from a wealthy family. He started off as a foot soldier, moved his way up, and then was elected emperor. And he did quite a few things to stop the 3rd century crisis. And make sure that you can discuss this either on the quiz or in the discussion board. One thing he ended up doing is redoing the coins. So I just mentioned that you've got this big devaluation of coins with this input of copper into the silver. He tried to stop that, and he started minting new coins that contained more and more silver. Another thing he ended up doing to make taxation a little bit easier is you had 50 provinces in the Roman Empire. He doubled those and made 100. Now, some people complain that he actually doubled the bureaucracy and it cost a little bit more, but this made a lot of things much easier for the Roman Empire. Another really important thing he did, which affects Rome for a very long time, is he divided the empire into 2 bits. He said one person, it was too big for one person to control. And what he ended up doing is creating something called the tetrarchy. Now, the tetrarchy means the rule of 4. And again, tetra is 4, and then arch is ruler, like monarchy. So tetrarchy is the rule of 4. And what he ended up doing is creating an emperor in the west, and he remained the emperor in the east. And then he created an office called a Caesar, which acts something like a vice president. So remember I told you that there were a number of emperors during the 200s. Diocletian wanted to stop that. So what would happen is if an emperor died, then the Caesar would take over and become emperor. So everyone knew who was next in terms of the line of power. He also improved the military. He made it smaller and he made it faster. And he also issued something called the Price Edict. And what this edict did is it gave a list of the prices of everything, the maximum price. Sometimes it's called the Maximum Price Edict. So what it said, for example, is that all over the Roman Empire, a loaf of bread had to be $1. It can be lower, but it cannot be higher. And if you charge more, you could be put to death. So this is one way that he tried to stop this inflation. And it did really work. So what I have here is a map of the Roman Empire. And here is a few images of the tetrarchy. Remember, that's the rule of 4. And then, as I mentioned, I do want to talk a little bit about the Great Persecution. So I'd already talked about the Manichaeans, and if you remember, the last series of slides were about this Great Persecution. So what had happened is one of the governors in Egypt sent a letter to Diocletian and complained about the Manichaeans, and he started to persecute them with his edict. This led to more persecutions against other Christians, and he issued a whole series of edicts that led to all of these persecutions. And what I have here is a fairly long text by a man named Lactantius, and he wrote a book called On the Deaths of the Persecutors. And what I'd like you to do is to stop the video and to read through this. And what this is, it's the explanation of why the Great Persecution started. Okay, so as you can see in this, under the death of the persecutors, section 10, you've got Diocletian and Galerius, his Caesar, trying to tell what was happening in the future. So what they ended up doing is killing some animals. They would look at the liver, and what they discovered is that there were Christians nearby doing the sign of the cross on their foreheads. And this is the next slide of this. So again, what I'd like you to do is to stop the video and to read through this. So what Diocletian did, and you've already read this, is that he ordered that everyone in his household and all soldiers could not be Christians. And what you also read is later, his Caesar Galerius, who becomes the emperor when Diocletian retires, he convinces Diocletian to expand the persecution empire-wide. So that's what you have here. A very important source for this time period is a man named Eusebius. And I've mentioned Eusebius before, and especially his History of the Church, where I was giving you evidence of how some of these early Christian texts are being used. Eusebius lived through the Great Persecution. And again, what I'd like you to do is to stop the video and read through this particular section. So what you can see here is that Diocletian issued his decree. He ordered churches to be torn down, scriptures to be destroyed, and then if anyone professes Christianity, they would have their freedom taken away. And as you can see here, what Eusebius says, there were a number of decrees in rapid succession. And what it ended up doing is it tried to force early Christians to denounce Christ. And if you remember, we talked about the Decian persecution in between 249 and 251, and this issuing of libelli. So the same thing was happening here.